Whenever a trade happens, right? Whenever somebody sells something and somebody buys something, then there must be some surplus, and meaning that both sides must benefit. Otherwise, they wouldn't do the transaction, right? And so, one of the things that economists are most interested in is measuring that surplus and then trying to figure out if there's any way to increase it, right? And if there is, if we can increase the surplus, then we may not be operating as efficiently as possible. And so when we think about just a transaction between firms and consumers, one of the ways that we think about this is consumer surplus and producer surplus, and then the total surplus just being the sum of those two. And so from consumer surplus, what we get is the difference between how much a consumer would be willing to pay, right, their willingness to pay, and what they actually have to pay. Um, and so that's the difference between the demand curve, which we said could be thought of as a consumer's willingness to pay, and the actual price. For a producer, the producer surplus is the difference between the revenue they get from selling and their marginal cost, right? Now, it's not quite profit because we have to take into account fixed costs as well, but we can think of profit as the producer surplus minus the fixed costs. And so here we have the marginal cost curve going up, the demand curve going down. We'll call this marginal cost curve the supply curve in the next chapter. And so we can notice that there is a special point here where they cross, right? And where they cross is where the total surplus is maximized. So let's think about that point for a minute, where we're calling the price just P0 and the quantity Q0. So someone who is willing to pay a lot for this car, but only has to pay P0, is getting a lot of consumer surplus, right? The difference between the demand curve and the purchase price. But someone who is only willing to pay just that purchase price, they're like, oh, should I buy? Should I not buy? I really don't care. But if they do buy, they basically get no consumer surplus. And so the total consumer surplus is this triangle under the demand curve and above this price, right? And we'll see that this is a sort of special place in the next chapter when we're talking about perfectly competitive markets. For the firm, right, they're getting this price and then they're paying this marginal cost. And so the difference is sort of the addition to their profit, right? It's marginal profit, even if the total area is not total profit. And so at this point F, they're basically making no marginal profit by selling that last unit. And so if we are at this point F, then there's no more additional surplus to be had, right? The consumers are not willing to pay, beyond that, and because firms are not willing to produce, right? So firms would be losing profit, consumers would be losing surplus if we, for instance, produced any more and charged that price P0. In our example here in chapter 7, we're assuming that firms have some market power, right? They're pricing off the demand curve in order to maximize their profits. And so in our example, they are producing at point E. And so at point E, they're getting positive profit, and the total surplus is actually lower. And so what we can see in this case, right, is that the price is higher than that price P0. And so the consumer surplus is lower. And that means that our consumer surplus is only this small triangle up here under the demand curve. The producer surplus is larger, right? They've gained this additional rectangle. And that's because they're producing at the point that maximizes their profit. But that means that there's a whole bunch of trades that could happen, but that aren't happening. And the reason they aren't happening is that the profit that the firms would make, this bottom triangle, is smaller than the profit that they would lose by decreasing their price, right? We'll see in chapter 8 that under certain circumstances, we can actually get to point F, but they are not too realistic for many markets, right? Many markets are much more like this, in which case there is a deadweight loss. And so we call that deadweight loss, meaning that there are trades that could happen, but don't happen for whatever reason. And in this case, it's because firms have some market power. And that means that this point E is not Pareto efficient, right? Point F is Pareto efficient. Nobody can be made better off without making someone else worse off, whereas point E is not Pareto efficient, right? And the reason that we're at point E, though, is because firms have some market power. And so that's really important.